Why hello my fellow apes, I hope you are well. Welcome to the second in my series of responses to Dr. Jordan Peterson's roundtable on Exodus. Having a rating on IMDb of 5.8 out of 10, Dr. Jordan B. Peterson is joined by formidable theological and literary scholars to circle-jerk conservative talking points.
And we're going to see that there's something else going on here that is far more cosmic and deeper than what you can imagine.
Yes, Jonathan, cosmically deep, powerful stuff.
There is only power.
In the last episode, we witnessed the crew interpret from a few verses in Exodus that postmodernism is many bad, that Marxism is many sad, and, of course, that atheism has the problem of good.
If theists are faced with the problem of evil, atheists are confronted with the problem of good.
And we got all of this from just a few lines describing midwives refusing to kill baby boys on command of the Pharaoh.
Far more cosmic and deeper than what you can imagine.
And in this episode, we are still watching our literary scholars ricochet from the same verses on the midwives, but we're going down a very different path. The path of evolutionary morality. Now, as you're likely aware, I frequently disagree with Jordan on numerous topics, but on this topic, you're going to find that we share quite a lot in common. And, I have in part Jordan to thank for my current moral views, and especially his amplification of Carl Jung. Talking of Jung, and to thank our sponsor, did you know that Blinkist has a succinct version of his book, Man and His Symbols? Well, with them having 5,500 titles covering 27 different categories, it's probably not all that surprising. They even have Jordan Peterson's Beyond Order and 12 Rules for Life. Blinkist provides key ideas from non-fiction bestsellers in minutes, and their app is really easy to use. What's more, for me at least, it makes for an awesome workout companion. If you have a title in mind, you can search for it, such as what I'm doing here with Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, which, I assure you, is exceptionally relevant to what we're going to discuss in this video. Now, one of the best things about Blinkist is that you can share your collections with anyone who has a Blinkist account by utilising their Blinkist spaces, which for me, at least, has encouraged me to learn more. And if you sign up through me, you'll get a 7-day free trial and 25% off Blinkist Annual Premium. To take advantage of this great deal, simply click my link below or scan the QR code on screen. You've got nothing to lose. Alright, big thanks to Blinkist for supporting the channel, but now we must return to the book of Exodus.
Part of the manner in which God is portrayed throughout the biblical corpus, but I would say in traditions around the world, as that phenomenon that alerts you to your own misbehavior. And it is really something, again, I really learned from Jung, contra Freud in some real sense, is that, and contra Nietzsche, who believed that maybe we could create our own values, is that there's something within that is transcendent because it isn't only in you, it's in everyone in some fundamental and real sense, plus it's eternal in some fundamental and real sense, and it calls you on your misbehavior.
Alright, there's quite a lot said there, and so let's identify the claims. Jordan begins by highlighting our moral intuitions that guide us, if you will, noting that religious traditions typically identify this guidance with the transcendent.
God is portrayed throughout the biblical corpus, but I would say in traditions around the world, as that phenomenon that alerts you to your own misbehavior.
And I agree, we have deep moral intuitions, and the way that different cultures around the world have at least historically attempted to make sense of this is through their various religious beliefs. Jordan then noted that Carl Jung understood that there's something deep within us, whereas Sigmund Freud and Friedrich Nietzsche didn't.
Something, again, I really learned from Jung, and contra Nietzsche, who believed that maybe we could create our own values, is that there's something within.
And again, I agree with Jordan. We don't come with a blank slate. But here's where I disagree. Jordan insists that this intuitive force is within everyone, and thus exists eternally and fundamentally. Our conscience is not merely present in each individual, but it's a universal feature that transcends us.
Because it isn't only in you, it's in everyone in some fundamental and real sense, plus it's eternal in some fundamental and real sense.
Now, of course, Jordan's vague words of some fundamental and real sense,
Some fundamental and real sense,
allows him to be interpreted in a few ways. For instance, it allows theists to interpret him as meaning that this thing within us is literally eternal and fundamental, that it's of a divine nature. There are, after all, a lot of theists that subscribe to the Daily Wire that literally believe in the doctrines preached from the pulpit. Likewise, many of the other esteemed colleagues at the table with Jordan take this stuff literally. However, these vague words also allow theists to dismiss atheists like me should we interpret Jordan in the same way as just laid out. Consequently, there's not much to be said here, since the terms are not clearly defined. Despite this, I'll comment all the same. While I think it's true to say that most of us possess this intuitive moral foundation, I think there's a small percentage of us that don't. Namely, psychopaths. Psychopaths are known for not having these moral intuitions. They're known for having impaired empathy and remorse, and bold, egotistical traits. More importantly, however, I think it's very obviously an error to infer from the fact that most of us have this intuitive force that it's therefore eternal and fundamental, even in a metaphorical sense. Our moral intuition dies when we die, and thus is no more eternal than is our sight. The fact that nearly all humans experience vision doesn't mean that vision is eternal and fundamental. Anyhow, back to the Exodus crew.
So the problem on the atheist front is, on what basis can these things can be claimed as self-evident? What's the grounding for that if it's just not? And the postmodern critique of that in some sense is that, well, all that nonsense talk about rights and freedoms is just instrumental camouflage, hiding a more fundamental will to power and desire to oppress.
A problem on the atheist front, huh? Atheists and theists alike seek an explanation for our moral intuitions, a grounding, as Jordan put it.
What's the grounding for that?
It's not uniquely an atheist problem. As we made clear in our last episode, the only supposed grounding for morality that's not available to the atheist is divine command theory, which, in fact, isn't morality at all.
This was simply Victor's justice.
Well said, James. It's might makes right. And upon presenting atheism with this problem, Jordan then gave us the postmodern critique. Because of course he bloody did.
And the postmodern critique of that in some sense.
Oh, no, sorry guys. He qualified it by saying in some sense.
Some sense.
So critiquing his critique is pretty much pointless. There's too much wiggle room. And I've got to say, this postmodern boogeyman is a dialectical disaster. Conflating atheism, in some sense, with postmodernism as to hand-wave atheism away is akin to conflating theism, in some sense, with young earth creationism to hand-wave theism away. But putting postmodernism aside, and as said, there are many ways to make sense of our moral intuitions that are compatible with atheism. But rather than presenting a model myself, I'll let Jordan provide one in the following lengthy clip.
That's partly why I'm often interested in talking to biologists. You know, I've talked to Frans de Waal most recently, and he's a primatologist who's worked on elucidating the principles by which chimpanzees organize their social hierarchies. And the Marxist, really, and classic biological take on that for simple-minded biologists is that the chimps use will to power, right? The alpha chimp is the most powerful, most dominant, meanest, roughest, boxer, oppressor. And de Waal's work, conducted over about 30 years, has showed that that's not just wrong, it's anti-true in some sense. So it's exactly the opposite of the reality. Now and then you can get a chimp who rules by power, but it destabilizes the troop emotionally and socially, and his reign tends to be short, brutal, and meet an extremely violent and murderous end. It's not an effective strategy, and what de Waal has shown that is to stabilize the iterative interactions within a troop. The alpha male, who sometimes can be the smallest male in the troop, has to be more reciprocal than any other individual in the troop. And so the basis of chimpanzee power is peacemaking, reciprocity, and stable long-term social relations between males and between the more authoritative males and females.
In case you'd like to see what Jordan is conveying here on camera, I'd recommend checking out a documentary titled Rise of the Warrior Apes. It's available on YouTube. Within it, a very brutal ape becomes the alpha through force.
But you can't lead if no one follows you.
But since the alpha relies on strength alone, he lacks kinship with the other males, who eventually beat the living crap out of him.
Those chimps who play that game of just sheer power never seem to last very long at the top spot.
Chimp societies, like human societies, are predicated on group survival, and so nature heavily selects for reciprocative tendencies. Chimp societies are not one-dimensional strength-based, as Jordan was conveying. On this note, I want to pause here to ask you a question. Did you notice how many qualifiers Jordan gave us at the beginning? He began by mentioning the Marxist view of biology.
The Marxist, really,
Then specified that he's talking about the classical biological view.
classic biological take.
And then further specified that he's addressing the simple-minded biological take,
For simple-minded biologists,
which all amounts to him addressing quite the specific view, a view that's held today, ironically, by creationists, not biologists. Those that study nature have long known that social hierarchies are never this simple. Even Charles Darwin knew this, as we can see from a quote from The Descent of Man. When two tribes of primeval man, living in the same country, come into competition, if the one tribe included a great number of courageous, sympathetic and faithful members, who were always ready to warn each other of danger, to aid and defend each other, this tribe would succeed better and conquer the other. Selfish and contentious people will not cohere, and without coherence, nothing can be effected. A tribe rich in the above qualities would spread and be victorious over the other tribes. So if the dude that figured out evolution didn't hold the classical biological take that Jordan's referring to, then who precisely is Jordan addressing with his critique? Who are these simple-minded biologists that hold such a narrow view? Again, we're at a dead end here, because there's always going to be someone who held or holds such a low-resolution view. In any case, with Jordan getting this biological reciprocity on the table, we now hear from James Orr, the star of our last episode.
But does that allow us to use the language, does that analysis allow us to use the language of good, or rather, are we only licensed by Dewell's analysis to speak of adaptive value, reproductive fitness?
well, I'm kind of hoping they go like this because, the idea of the reciprocity that allows the alpha chimps to maintain their sovereignty across time is something very much like treat your neighbor as if he's yourself. And so I think that there's no reason to assume that the ethic, if it's transcendent, couldn't emerge out of the material and descend in some sense from the spiritual at the same.
Without reducing goodness to a mere morality, to a mere survival mechanism.
Right. Well, and it's not so mere either, right? If it's a survival mechanism, it's pretty damn deep. And we could also think, if we were expanding our notion of what constitutes the biological, we could also think of the patterns of behavior that are most germane to our survival as transcendent. They're embodied, they're instinctual, they're outside the propositional domain.
Alright, so here Jordan is suggesting that the reciprocity observed in chimpanzee behaviour, which is crucial for maintaining their survival, shares similarities with the moral principle of loving your neighbour as yourself, a principle that's found in pretty much all societies and religions.
The idea of the reciprocity that allows the alpha chimps to maintain their sovereignty across time is something very much like treat your neighbor as if he's yourself.
Once again, I'm in agreement with Jordan here. A social species is going to favour a leader that looks after the tribe, that loves their neighbour. But always remember, buckos, that the definition of who actually counts as a neighbour is going to do all the heavy lifting. Recall that Israelite slaves are to be treated much, much, much nicer than the slaves that you get from the lands around you. And when it comes to females, well, think of them as your neighbour's glorified cattle. Anyhow, in response to Jordan's suggestion, James raised concern about reducing morality to a mere survival mechanism.
Are we only licensed by Dewell's analysis to speak of adaptive value, reproductive fitness?
It's a great question. Even if these deep-rooted intuitions aid in our survival, that's not morality, is it? We'll get to Jordan's response soon enough, but first I want to give you my own. I'll be the atheist at the table, and I'm going to approach this through Hume's guillotine. I appreciate, of course, that many of you will be well aware of David Hume's guillotine, his is-ought distinction, but here's a brief recap. Hume noticed that when people discuss morality, they often quickly shift from describing how the world is, that is, making factual or descriptive statements, to all of a sudden prescribing how the world ought to be, that is, making normative, moral, prescriptive statements. To give you an example, imagine that Jordan's round table of scholars are in a park having a postmodern picnic, and from a nearby bench we describe what we can see. Dennis eating everyone else's lunch.
You don't need it.
Not surprisingly, we can also see that the rest of the crew are upset and hungry. These are all descriptive statements that depict the scene as it is. Now let's say that Karl Marx comes in and sits next to us. Lucky us. And upon seeing what we see, he notices that the food isn't being evenly distributed. Outraged, Marx stands up and starts bellowing that the Exodus crew ought to share their food equally. That is, Marx issues a prescriptive statement that depicts what the scene ought to be. Well, here's where David Hume comes in. Hume sits next to us and smiles as he calmly educates Marx, pointing out that he's made a massive and sudden leap from solely describing how things are to prescribing how things ought to be. He even spells it out in a syllogism. We can't derive from the fact that 1, the food isn't being distributed evenly, and 2, the rest of the crew are hungry, that, therefore, they ought to distribute the food evenly. It just doesn't follow. The first 2 premises are factual statements, whereas the conclusion is a value statement. Likewise, and to tie this to James's concern, we can't derive from the fact that 1, reciprocity increases the chances of a social species surviving, and 2, the members of a social species want to survive, that, therefore, the members ought to be reciprocative. It just doesn't follow. The first 2 premises are factual statements, whereas the conclusion is a value statement. If we're dealing with mere facts, we can't derive an or. In order to get a prescriptive conclusion, we need, at least implicitly, at least one prescriptive ought premise. We can't do it from facts alone. So that's Hume's thesis, and while there's plenty of people who reject it, such as Sam Harris, there are plenty of people that think it's sound, such as Sean Carroll. Now, unless I'm mistaken, the vast majority of philosophers think that it's sound, and for what it's worth, I'm very much in that category. Hume has most certainly got this right. There are very few things in philosophy, in fact, that I am more certain of. Getting back to Jordan and James's exchange, then, what are we to make of the deep survival mechanisms that Jordan's referring to?
It's not so mere either, right? If it's a survival mechanism, it's pretty damn deep.
As just discussed, we can't get an ought from an is, but in the chimp scenario that Jordan has laid out, is that what we're looking at? Are we simply describing that 1, chimps want to survive, 2, reciprocity is a very effective way for them to survive, so, therefore, they ought to be reciprocative? Well, I think that the answer is no. We're not getting an ought from an is here, but rather describing an ought from an ought. The first premise, that the chimps want to survive, is from our vantage point a descriptive statement, a factual statement that we've inferred from observation. We look at chimps and judge by their actions that they, like us, want to survive. But what's going on in the chimp's head? Is the first premise to them simply a description? No, it's not. It's a prescriptive imperative. The chimps are simply convinced that they, and indeed their neighbours, ought to survive, that it's the right thing to do. Now, does that mean that they ought to think that they ought to survive? No, but we don't need that in order to bridge the gap here, and this isn't the place to delve into metaethics. For our purposes, we just need to recognise that the first premise is an ought statement, a prescriptive proposition, and that the second premise is merely providing an objective way of achieving the value embodied in the first premise. We can put it syllogistically as follows. Premise 1, myself and my loved ones ought to survive. And note that we're convinced of this proposition from the get-go, courtesy of evolution by natural selection. Note further that it doesn't matter in this scenario why we're convinced of this proposition. All that matters is that we are indeed convinced of the proposition. Premise 2. Reciprocative behaviour increases the chances of myself and my loved ones surviving. Conclusion, therefore I ought to be reciprocative. In this scenario, the conclusion logically follows from the premises. It doesn't violate Hume's guillotine. The chimps are not getting a prescriptive conclusion from entirely descriptive premises, since the first premise is prescriptive. Where things get confusing, of course, is when we try to analyse this from an external perspective. Since we're not the chimps in question, we have to describe the fact that they are acting on prescription, and this gives the illusion that the first premise is descriptive. To navigate this, we could specify the first premise as follows. It is the case that the chimps are convinced that they ought to survive. In this case, it's tempting to say that there's no ought premise, but there is, it's just implicit. Alright, so if you're with me so far, we can make sense of the chimps acting according to reciprocative ends in a way that doesn't violate Hume's guillotine. We're not talking merely about facts of survival, we're talking about values and prescriptions that social species have presuppositional conviction in. But so what? Again, we can ask, is this morality or merely survival? Well, it depends on what you mean by morality and survival, doesn't it? The religious, for instance, tend to define objective values as if they're necessarily, eternally and fundamentally fixed, as if they're a universally applicable set of codes. In this case, the answer would be no. We're not talking about morality itself here, but rather the way that God has seen fit to have us evolve to recognize morality.
There's no reason to assume that the ethic, if it's transcendent, couldn't emerge out of the material.
But if we define morality as simply right and wrong conduct, then we are talking about objective morality, namely evolutionary morality. Evolutionary morality states that there is an objective framework for moral behaviour, where objective values can be understood as those that align with evolved tendencies and contribute to individual and societal flourishing. Now, evolutionary morality is compatible with a fundamental and eternal view of morality, as specified 30 seconds ago. But in and of itself, evolutionary morality suggests that morality is not fundamental and eternal, but rather a product of genetic, cultural, social, and individual factors, which entails that moral values can vary across different contexts and societies. Now, just to clear up some potential confusion, evolutionary morality is not the same thing as moral relativism. I know that some people are going to confuse the two because, frankly, I once did. Evolutionary morality posits that moral principles and behaviours are evolved through biological and cultural processes, serving the purpose of enhancing human well-being and survival, and it entails that there is indeed an objective foundation. Moral relativism, on the other hand, posits that morality arises from different cultural backgrounds and perspectives, with judgments about right and wrong being subjective and culturally relative, and it entails that there is not an objective foundation. So, to answer James's question, it depends on how we define morality. Now, just before we move on, let's hear Jordan bolster his response to James.
We could also think, if we were expanding our notion of what constitutes the biological, we could also think of the patterns of behavior that are most germane to our survival as transcendent. They're embodied, they're instinctual, they're outside the propositional domain.
Unfortunately, this is again where conveniently vague language is doing all of the heavy lifting. Jordan's claim is pretty straightforward. Our moral intuitions are transcendent and outside of the propositional domain.
Transcendent, they're embodied, they're instinctual, they're outside the propositional domain.
But his premises are as vague as Deepak Chopra on mushrooms. He's qualified that we need to expand our notion of what constitutes the biological.
If we were expanding our notion of what constitutes the biological,
and that we could also think of our patterns of behaviour that are most essential to our survival in this way.
We could also think of the patterns of behaviour that are most germane to our survival as transcendent.
I honestly don't know where to start with this, because I know that whatever angle I take, I'll be accused of just not understanding his cosmically deep wisdom. I will say this, however. These propositions are not outside of the propositional domain. They're outside of the solely descriptive domain. They're imbued with prescriptive propositions. Okay. With that, let's hear James's response.
Although often it's the case that we think of the highest moral act as extinction, laying down one's life, that is, surrendering our opportunities for survival and the survival of our kin.
So the idea here is that moral intuitions of self-sacrifice constitute strong evidence against the thesis of morality being tethered to evolution. After all, if we've evolved to survive, then we shouldn't have the intuition to sacrifice our life for others, should we? That, at least, is the gist of the objection.
Surrendering our opportunities for survival and the survival of our kin.
In the 8th chapter of The Origin of Species, Darwin took this objection very seriously, but he proposed what is now known as kin selection. In a nutshell, when an individual organism engages in self-sacrifice, while they eliminate their own reproductive opportunities, they increase the reproductive opportunities of their related kin, who possess similar genes. Paradoxically, then, the sacrifice increases the overall reproductive success of the social species they belong to. We've evolved to survive as individuals, of course, but as a social species, our deepest evolutionary imperatives are for our genetics to survive, and our genetics are shared by our group. We don't need to survive as individuals. Hence, the motif or archetype of sacrifice featuring so prominently in religions and so many of our heroic stories isn't arbitrary. A social species is going to venerate those that sacrifice themselves for the hive. And talking of hives, if you want quite an obvious example of kin selection, consider the fact that when a bee stings a threat, they die. If evolution selected for individuals to survive, then the bee would never have evolved this mechanism, would it? But if evolution selects, at least when it comes to social species, for populations to survive, then the bee's kamikaze weapon makes perfect sense. It's not mysterious at all. An individual bee sacrificing itself wounds and thus propels predators, which allows the hive to survive for another day. Trust me, if bees are religious, they've got a Jesus, but unlike our Jesus, who sacrificed himself for a weekend, which, let's face it, isn't really a sacrifice in some sense, I'd like to think that bee Jesus actually sacrificed herself, and not to overcome the barbaric concept of inherited sin.
Yeah, well, right. So there are definitely times where mere proximal survival seems to contradict an even deeper instinct.
Yep. That's another way of expressing this. While we have an instinct to survive, we have a deeper instinct to make sure that our society survives, an instinct that we're not often even conscious of. Jordan then goes on to give an example of the Titanic and how the men sacrificed themselves to save the women and children.
Many men sacrificed themselves to save the women and the children.
And then he expresses that maybe the contradiction can be ironed out.
If it's serving a higher order ethical precept that is even more fundamentally related to survival across time, then maybe the contradiction could be ironed out.
I, for one, not only think that it can be ironed out, but that it very obviously is. I don't think it's hard to understand why we have these intuitions at all. Darwin got this right from the very get-go. Finally, James appreciates Jordan's rebuttal, and the conversation moves on to postmodernism, Marxism, woman ruining society, and what have you.
I suppose in evolutionary terms, the logical thing would be, though, for the women and the children to go first on the Titanic.
Yeah, well, the men are more expendable, right? Because you need fewer men. If push comes to shove, you need fewer men.
And that is where I'm going to end it today. As I hope I've successfully communicated, it seems that I actually share quite a lot of the same views as Jordan when it comes to our moral intuitions. And I say seems because, unfortunately, it's really hard to know what Jordan actually thinks. He uses so many qualifiers, with his choice words being extremely prone to equivocation, as to make him as interpretable as much of the Bible. But at least in terms of the basic substrate, it seems that we agree. Where we disagree, it seems, is when he heavily suggests that the grounding of our moral intuition is of a supernatural transcendent source that's eternal and fundamental. I think that all of these ontologically extremely expensive propositions only serve to soothe our ego. They do not provide any further explanatory value. They are an egregious violation of Occam's razor. Evolution by kin selection provides all the explanatory value we need, and it doesn't cost us much in terms of what we have to believe. In fact, since most of us already believe in evolution, it costs us nothing. Whereas the view that Jordan is suggesting requires us to buy kin selection all the same, and then, in addition, that there's a supernatural realm, that this intuition of ours transcends the natural realm, that it's eternal for some reason, and that it's foundational to the very universe, again for some reason. This, my fellow apes, is an extremely expensive set of propositions to buy. And for what? Because it doesn't provide any more explanatory value. No, to the contrary, this raises hundreds of more questions that cry out for their own explanation. Occam is turning in his grave. Anyhow, as always, thank you kindly for the view, and an extra special thank you to my wonderful patrons and YouTube members. Thank you very, very much for your support. It really does make a difference.